Alright, so this morning we're going to be talking about the component lifecycle, the lifecycle of web components. And as we mentioned yesterday, this is sort of the stages that a component goes through, the stages that an element goes through during its life in a web application. So it's a circle of life, HTML element. There are 4 stages in this cycle. We have created, attached, attribute changed, and detached. Learn these 4 things. These are the 4 important points of this life cycle. And then the 4 points that you're going to be able to hook into and do things at each of these points in the life cycle. These points in the life cycle will also exist in Polymer with, I think, slightly different names, but they have the 4 same points that you can hook into. So next week when you do some Polymer, you'll get a sense of how those lifecycle callbacks work. So when I say callback, what do I mean? A callback is a function. Specifically, it's a function that we call after something's done. It's a term that we use to refer to a function that we call after we've done something. And so for each of these are functions that are going to be called at each of these points in the component's life. So you're not calling these functions specifically, they are being called for you by the element. So just keep that in mind. We don't have to call them, but we do have to define them if we want to use them. So if we create this function, the element's going to call it when it gets to this point in the life cycle. So what do they look like? Well, let's start at the top here. We have L prototype. We've seen this yesterday. Some sort of like custom element prototype. Object.create, we create a blank object with HTML element.prototype as its prototype. So we're creating an HTML element copy here. Now we have the 4 lifecycle callbacks. So it's just the name of the lifecycle point and then the word callback. So created callback, attached callback, attribute changed callback, and detached callback. And I'm just setting these up to be empty functions right now. If they're not there, they're not going to get called. If they're there, they're going to get called. So now I can put things in each one of these functions, and when that function is called by the element at each of these points in its life cycle, certain things will happen. So you can define things to happen at these points in the life cycle. And again, I'm just going to call document.registerElement. That gets me my custom element, and then I pass my prototype. This life cycle is part of all HTML elements. Other HTML elements have a life cycle. It's interesting to us because we're building our own HTML elements when we use document.registerElement, when we use custom elements. So this is part of that custom elements part of web components. Alright, so created. We've actually already seen the created callback. What do we do in the created callback in our components? You remember?
Created register?
Created shadow DOM. Yep. We register after. We pass in that object after, but I heard created shadow DOM. Something else? What do we do when we create our shadow root and then we attach something to it? We append a child to it. The template, right? We take our template content, we do our whole import node thing, and then we attach it to the shadow root. The place where all of that happens is in our created callback. So the created callback is when the element is created and the definition is registered. So this means that whenever you're creating that element, when you call document.createElement, or when you put it on the page and it's been registered, this created callback is going to be called. This is sort of the start of that life cycle. So we can do a bunch of stuff here. We already have seen that we do create shadow root. And one thing that I want to point out here is that instead of doing document.querySelector and create shadow root, we can say this.create shadow root. Within our callback, this is going to refer to the instance of that element. And so we're going to have access to that specifically, and so we can just say this.create shadow root. We don't have to figure out what class name it has or something like that. And this is what allows us to be able to make multiple of those on the fly without having to iterate through an array of items. Whenever an element is created, we're going to say that element, create a shadow root on it. We can clone the template, document.import node, pass in my template. Obviously, I'll have to have defined this variable template somewhere else, somewhere above here. You do my cloning template. I can append that to my shadow root. I can also set default event listeners. If I want to set an event listener on that particular element, this is where I can do that. This here, again, refers to that instance of the element. And so I know HTML element, I have add event listener. That's a thing that I can do. We talked about that yesterday. This is where I can do it if I want to set some default listener. Does that make sense? Created, callback. So that's one of those four. The next one is attach. So while we can create an element, think about a point where we can create an element programmatically using document.createElement. When we call document.createElement, some of you have run into this bug where you call the element document.createElement and it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't show up anywhere. It's because we haven't actually put it onto the DOM. So we only really run into this situation where we have a difference between created and attached to the DOM when we're doing that programmatically. And so attached is when we actually attach that to the DOM. So if you create an element, document.createElement, that's when you're going to get created. And then when you go ahead and append that node, append child or something like that, to append it to the DOM, that's when you're going to get attached. You know, there's not really too much to do here. But you can certainly, that's supposed to be attached callback. I apologize, it was a typo. Attached callback. There's not too much to do here, but you could certainly use it if you wanted to. All right, attribute changed. This one is important. This is when an attribute on the element was added, removed, or changed. I apparently just copied and pasted, so that's attribute change callback, not created callback. And so when you do attribute change callback, you get 3 parameters in that function. So while all these other ones didn't have anything that was useful to pass into the function, this one will get 3 things passed in. One is the name of the attribute. The second is the old value, the previous value of the attribute. And the third is the new value of the attribute. So if you change the ID attribute from foo to bar, you're going to get ID and name, foo and old value, and bar and new value. Does that make sense? All right, and the last is detach. So, I actually did get that one right.
What did you say about foo and bar? What foo and bar?
Yeah, so let's say I have 2 strings, one called foo and one called bar.
Okay.
Random names. And I have an ID set on as an attribute on my element. And then I change it. I say set attribute ID and I change it from foo to bar. When on this callback, I'm going to have ID as a string that I can access as the parameter in my function. I'm also going to have the old value, foo, the previous value of ID, and then the new value of the ID, bar. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay, and then also with detached versus created, can you just go back to the attached one?
Yeah, so attached, again, this would be attached callback.
So that's just a simpler version of the created, because the created has that same, like, you have all this stuff inside the created one, but you have nothing inside this one.
So remember, I can put anything inside, whether it's simple or not, doesn't have to do with the callback, it has to do with what I write in that function. It's not that created is, or attached is simpler than created. It's just that we do most of what we need in created, and so attached isn't as useful, but it just depends on your element, right? Like there might be times when you want to do something specific when that element is attached to the DOM and differentiate that from created. This is one of the 4 lifecycle callbacks, so just understanding where that fits into the lifecycle is helpful. But for most of the stuff that we're doing here, we're just putting it all in created. All right, so detach is when the element is removed to the DOM, and this is where you put any cleanup. You might remove event listeners here that are being attached. Yeah?
Does that mean that changing the attributes of a certain element has to be done through JavaScript?
If you are changing attributes after the page is loaded, there's no other way to do it except through JavaScript.
Okay.
Think about, how would you do it, right? Like you would do it with set attribute. I think this would get fired if you open up DevTools and change the attribute in the elements panel. That would probably get fired, so I guess that's not through JavaScript. But it's in the state of your application, the lifecycle of your application, that's going to happen through JavaScript. And this is is when we add them, remove them, or change them. So, circle of life. That's the life cycle. It's a short little presentation there, but now that we understand that life cycle, we can start applying these to all of our elements. So now we can start to add functionality to our elements. And this is where things start to get interesting, because now we're not just creating an element and putting a shadow root onto it, which is cool, but now we can actually start to create functionality there. We can do things with our slider. We can do things, we can pass in attributes, we can change attributes, we can respond to that change. So I'm just going to demo, the exercise is to add our lifecycle methods to our style guide components. And at this point, we have a couple components that we haven't done yet. One is that tabs component that we never got to on day one. And then we have that accordion component that we haven't implemented either. So for the exercises, I'd like to take those and try to implement those. They'll be helpful now that we understand how to do lifecycle methods. We can also add, I'd like to add an attribute to that slideshow component that we have. And so for the slideshow component, you hard-coded a timeout, an interval, so that every 500 milliseconds or every 5 seconds or 2 seconds or whatever it was, you were changing the image. Now I want you to set that as a attribute on your element, on your slide element. And so that means that when you have to respond to that element, if it changes, that attribute, if it changes on your element. So how do we get an attribute on a DOM element? Anyone know? We have a method. This isn't web component specific. This is HTML specific.
Get the attribute of the tag.
Yeah.
So the get attribute method.
Get attribute, exactly.
Right.
There we go. So get attribute gets us an attribute. Set attribute sets an attribute. So we can do that within our element as well. So if I'm in anywhere here, right? So let's say in created, this is where I would say, what would I use dot get attribute? So I have something dot get attribute. I need it to be that element. How would I access that element in a created callback?
Any one of the variables that's identified in node.
Yeah, but what would it be inside here? I have it on in the callback as well. Sorry, used somewhere here.
It's not clone, is it?
Nope, not clone. I need to say something dot get attribute to get the current attribute. Say something dot get attribute ID. I want to get the ID. How would I get it?
Can you use clear selector?
I could, but
Shadow root.
that wouldn't be really. I can't use shadow root because the attribute's on my element, not on my shadow root. I could use query selector, but that would be a lot of work and it wouldn't really be scalable because now I'd have to know what class name or what element my object is. Yeah.
Did you access the parent node through shadow root or no?
I don't think I have access to that there. It's a lot easier than that. It's not that complicated.
This.
What was that?
This?
This, exactly. This. I'm already using it here. I have add event listener, right? I have element of add event listener is this. That's how I have access to it. That's how I have access to the instance. I say this dot get attribute. I can pass the name of the attribute I'm expecting and access it there. I can do the same thing in, an attribute change actually have it in a callback, right? Well, I have the name and I have the old value and the new value, so that's good, but I can actually get it as this in any of these callbacks. I can also create methods, and we'll talk a little bit more when we go into APIs for our components, but I can create methods here, and any method I create for my component, so prototype.foo, anything within this function, the this refers to the element. So this will be how you access that instance of the element. All right, so why don't we start with taking our slider and adding an attribute for what that interval is. Maybe call it interval, I don't know. In your created callback, you're going to want to set that. You already have, probably in the created callback, you already have your set interval. So instead of hard coding it, you're going to use your attribute there. Once you have that working, you might think you're all good to go, except what if someone changes that attribute after you add your element? Well, they'd be out of luck, it wouldn't change. They'd have to destroy the element and re-instantiate it. You want to give them all the flexibility they can get, so what you'll need is attribute change callback. You'll need to there. You'll also want to set a default, because if someone doesn't pass it in, you know, it's kind of just a nice thing to do to start the slider moving for them anyway.
I guess the conclusion I still have is in your created slide, aren't you attaching it still? Or no?
No, I'm not attaching it to the DOM here.
But
So
you're attaching it in the attached one?
this is attached is called when it has been attached to the DOM. So something from outside is creating it, something from outside is attaching it. These methods just get called when that happens. These are lifecycle methods. They're just sitting there until the lifecycle event happens, and then they're getting called.
And
So-
then you're just doing something that's already being activated that you code specifically for that action.
Exactly. These lifecycle events are happening whether you code a function for them or not.
Right.
It's just now that you have access to say, hey, when your attribute changed, instead of just like doing nothing, how about like you do something,
Right.
and you can tell what that something is. Make sense? All right, so start with the slider, and then go ahead and if you have anything else you want to add into your elements, go ahead and do that. One thing that might be fun, for example, is like being able to programmatically change the color of your like Hello World badge via an attribute. So, yeah, they use those. So you'll have to use the created and the attribute changed lifecycle functions to do that, and then you'll be able to add those to your function. After this, we'll dive into looking at some other examples of other people who have written components and elements. In particular, we'll look at the browser and how the browser writes an element, and see if it's similar to how we've been handling it this week. All right.